Hi, Econ students. Welcome to video lecture 2.4. We're talking about the elasticity of supply. Elasticity of supply is really looking at the sensitivity of the law of supply, right? We know when price goes up, the quantity supplied is going to go up. And when price goes down, the quantity supplied goes down because of profitability. But there are outside factors that might impact the amount that that quantity supply goes up or down based on what's happening to the price. That's elasticity, right? If it's highly sensitive to a change in price or highly elastic, an increase in price will result in a dramatic increase in the quantity supply. And if it's highly inelastic or relatively insensitive to a change in price, then an increase in price will result in a very small increase in the quantity supplied. That's the nuts and bolts of it. Let's dig into the details. So, price elasticity of supply asks this question. All right, we just talked about that. Do you think the supply of fidget spinners is inelastic or elastic, and why? Will suppliers be more sensitive to a change in price or less sensitive to a change in price? Well, if you answered that they are elastic, you are correct. You see, it's very easy for manufacturers to produce fidget spinners, right? There's no patent law protecting that type of a manufacturing. It requires a little bit of plastic, a couple of, I don't know, different parts, maybe two or three parts, and you're able to produce them and sell them. So when the price goes up, a lot of businesses can change their manufacturing to produce these to take advantage of the potential profits there. In other words, it's very easy to produce more fidget spinners. So as a result, when the price went up, there's a dramatic increase in the quantity supplied. And then when the price went down because demand fell for these fidget spinners, the quantity supplied dramatically went down as well. In other words, fidget spinners were highly elastic, very sensitive to a change in price. So let's take that same idea and apply it to all products, right? So the price elasticity supply looks like this. Again, it's how sensitive producers are, suppliers are to a change in price. Keep in mind what producers are always chasing, all about the profit, right? So an increase in price, I'm going to produce more of those things if it means that there's increased profitability. But if there's an increase in price and it's really difficult to produce that item, there's a high opportunity cost of transitioning all my manufacturing over to producing that, then it starts to cut into my potential profits. So I'm unlikely to increase the quantity supplied, at least as much. Very few firms will follow that increase in price, right? So think about profit. It will logically get you to where you want to be. The main factor here is the amount of time it takes to produce more, right? So elasticity of supply is basically based on time. If price went up for fidget spinners, well, it's really quick to produce more fidget spinners. So of course it's going to be highly elastic. But if the price goes up for jumbo jets, for example, well, it takes a ton of time to produce more jumbo jets. And so there's not going to be a dramatic increase in the quantity supplied. They're going to be relatively inelastic. Okay, so inelastic means insensitive to change. Again, increase in price results in kind of quasi increase in quantity supply. Law of supply is still there, but it doesn't have as dramatic of an impact. It looks like a nice steep curve as we can see here. Inelastic, just like demand, inelastic supply looks like an eye, upward slope or upward sloping, and it is very steep. Elastic is the opposite of that. It is going to be very flat because an increase in price results in a dramatic increase in quantity supplied, and a decrease in price can result in a dramatic decrease in quantity supplied, as we can see here in our supply curve. And then finally, perfectly inelastic. We talked a little bit about this with demand, but it shows up with supply actually quite frequently. In fact, we have a long run aggregate supply, as you might recall, is a perfectly inelastic supply curve. It means that there is a set quantity. Quantity is fixed. Price goes up and down, but businesses don't produce more or less because they can't. There's only a certain amount that is able to be produced. So that's perfectly inelastic, represented by a vertical supply line. Okay, so let's get into some characteristics here between elastic and inelastic. It's broken up into sort of a split chart here. General characteristics of inelastic supply are really hard to produce, right? Price goes up, firms want to produce more to take advantage of those profits. But if we're talking about, What's hard to produce? Uh, Nuclear reactors, those are hard to produce. If the price goes up for nuclear reactors, you're not going to see a dramatic increase in quantity supplied because it's hard to actually respond to that price. There are high barriers to entry, right? Um, Prices going up for electric cars, for example. But it's very difficult to produce electric cars. There's a few firms that kind of dominate the market, for example. There's a lot of regulations, right? So, not a lot of firms are going to join up and start producing more electric cars when the price goes up for them. So, as a result, they're relatively inelastic. There's a high cost associated with producing it or hyper specialized inputs that are difficult to get your hands on, right? So any of these items we're talking about, if the price goes up for tanks, for example, highly specialized materials that go into producing a modern tank and very, very high costs. So even if the price is going up to them, not a lot of firms are going to enter that market to produce those tanks because it is difficult to do so. And the profitability really isn't there for them. And then it's just hard to switch from producing an alternative good, right? Goes with these same other three characteristics. But whenever we're talking about an increase in the quantity supplied, it means a lot of firms were producing A and they're transferring over to producing B. It's very difficult to transfer from A to B. It's going to be relatively inelastic. And then finally, just like the elasticity of demand, we have a coefficient, which is the percent change in quantity over the percent change in price. And so if the quantity is changing at a smaller rate or a lower rate than the change in price, as we have with inelastic, insensitive, quantity doesn't change a lot, price changes a lot, you're going to have a coefficient of less than 1 as a result. Elastic is basically the opposite of all those things. If it's an elastic supply, it's easy to produce. So the price goes up for something like, I don't know, shoes. Shoes are relatively easy to produce. So price goes up for shoes. A lot of firms are going to start producing more shoes or more clothing, for example. They're very low barriers to entry. There's not a couple of firms that dominate the market. There are many, many firms. So, for example, if you want to open your own restaurant, relatively easy to produce, lots of restaurants out there, low barriers to entry, get a couple of permits, you're good to go. So if the price goes up for restaurant food, for example, then a lot of people are going to start producing more restaurant food. You're going to see an increase in the quantity supplied. They're very low cost or they're a generic input. So I can use, for example, with a fidget spinner, I can use the plastics I already have, I can use the bearings I already have, and just transfer over, use those very low cost materials to produce something that's very popular right now to get my portion of those profits. And then, of course, it's easy to switch from producing whatever else producing before to producing this and then switching back. If it's easy to transition over to producing something, it's going to be highly elastic, meaning I'm going to be able to follow that change in price. Price goes up, I produce a bunch more. Price goes down, I produce a bunch less. And then finally, remember that percent change in quantity over percent change in price, quantity over price. That quantity is highly sensitive to a change in price. There's going to be a bigger number than the change in price. So if quantity, the numerator is bigger than price, the denominator, then we're going to have a coefficient greater than 1, indicating elastic supply. Here's your visualization, just like the last one. We've got a perfectly inelastic supply curve here. It looks a lot like LRAS because it is. Quantity is fixed at this point. The elasticity coefficient will be 0 because the change in price goes up and down for sure. That's your denominator. But your numerator is going to be 0. Change in quantity is always going to be 0% because it's fixed. Then you have relatively inelastic with that coefficient less than 1, steep curve. Unit elastic, of course, is when the coefficient is 1 or percent change in quantity is equal to the percent change in price. Relatively inelastic has that flattened out curve. Elasticity coefficient is greater than 1 as a result. And then perfectly elastic is horizontal and it has a coefficient of infinity because a change in price is going to result in a change in quantity that is infinite. So your numerator is infinity, your denominator is whatever that change in price is. And so as a result, you're going to have a coefficient of infinity. In other words, you just have a fixed price for the goods that are supplied there. Okay, So that's elasticity coefficient. Try one out here. So we have a supply curve here. You've got your different dollar amounts. We're moving from point A to point B. Can you calculate the coefficient, elasticity coefficient of supply? We're moving from A to B. You can pause the video now. Try it out. Okay, did you get it? Well, here's what you got to remember. Remember, your coefficient equation is percent change in quantity over percent change in price. So how do I find my percent change in quantity? Well, we know percent change in anything is current minus previous divided by previous. So if I went from A to B and my current was 35, my previous was 20. So 35 minus 20, or 15, divided by my previous, 20. And I do that same thing with my price. I went from a price of 20 to 30. So current is 30 minus 20, which is my previous, which is 10, divided by my previous, which is 20, 10 divided by 20. So that will kick out this 0.75 divided by 0.5, or 75% divided by 50%, give you a coefficient of 1.5. Is 1.5 elastic or relatively inelastic? Of course, the answer is it's relatively elastic. The percent change in my quantity, which is at the top, was greater than my percent change in price, showing a slight change in price resulted in a greater impact on quantity. That is elastic. Okay, final question here, and then we're done with this video. Which of the following must be true of the original Michelangelo sculptures? The demand is relatively elastic. The supply is perfectly elastic. The demand is perfectly inelastic. The supply is perfectly inelastic. Or the demand is perfectly elastic. What do you think? If you selected the supply is perfectly inelastic, you're correct. Why? Because only a few of these exist on planet Earth. The quantity is fixed. A change in price for these does not impact the quantity provided at all, right? So as a result, vertical supply curve, demand will shift right and left, changing the price, changing the total revenue. If you sell them, absolutely, but the quantity will never change. In other words, the coefficient will be zero. Percent change in quantity will be zero. Percent change in price will be whatever it is, okay? And the coefficient will always be zero. That's it. Complete Khan Academy 2.4, which is your price elasticity of supply and its determinant. It's available for you now, and I will see you in class where we will emphasize certain things. Peace.